Prologue. The First Ripple. Revised. The year is 1915. The Arkansas night is thick and starless, a heavy velvet blanket smothering the piney woods. A ribbon of red dirt, blood dark in the gloom, cuts through the landscape. The only sound should be the chirping of crickets and the rustle of a possum in the brush. But tonight there is another sound. It's a low, grinding throb of bass and a wailing guitar, a Gothic dirge that vibrates through the humid air. A pair of weak, flickering headlamps pierces the darkness. A black Model T, looking like a motorized hearse, rattles down the road, its antique frame shuddering with a sound a half-century away from being invented. From inside, Typo Negative's Black Number 1 blasts from a system of mid-range woofers and tweeters that have no right to exist. We know who was in that car because the story remembers. It was Bill, Shelby, and yes, Proctor. Time travelers, all of them, coming back with the one thing that would curse and save a life, a rusty Huffy bicycle with one pedal and a bell. They didn't just drop it off, they delivered it. The car cruises past a small whitewashed farmhouse where the Proctor family sleeps. Inside, a one-year-old boy, the narrator of a story he doesn't yet know he's in, stirs in his crib, the alien sound a strange and fleeting invasion of his infant dreams. He didn't ask for the chaos. But maybe every curse is a strange sort of gift you send yourself. The Model T continues its impossible journey, the music fading down the dirt road until only the crickets remain. The next morning, Proctor's father steps onto the front porch, and then he stops cold. There, leaning against the porch rail as if it had been delivered by a ghost, is a 1998 Huffy bicycle. Its frame is already flecked with a fine layer of impossible rust. One pedal hangs like a broken tooth. It is an artifact of temporal mischief left on his doorstep, a quiet promise of the beautiful chaos to come. Chapter 1. The Author in the Dark. The cursed bicycle sat in my yard, a rusty, unyielding monument to suburban exasperation. It was a 1998 Huffy, with one pedal, and if the AI I vented to was to be believed, a basket full of shame. I'd tried to get rid of it, contemplated hauling it to the dump like the low-effort neighborhood vigilante I aspired to be, or simply putting it to the curb with a "free bike, probably" sign. But this was Arkansas. You couldn't just give things away lest you and the recipient end up in jail. Besides, the bike had seen things, and frankly, it was causing a philosophical crisis, making me question if I was even really here. My world was already operating on a different frequency than most. Even my cat had opinions. Zadie was technologically literate, emotionally volatile, and had called me on a mobile phone just yesterday, meowing his displeasure about the two-wheeled menace that had disrupted the delicate feng shui of the front lawn. I tried to reassure him, insisting the bicycle was a figment of your dang imagination, a line I knew was flimsy even as I said it. But the truth was, it was an artifact, a silent witness to a particular wild, lawless, whiskey-soaked Sunday of Southern mischief. When the visions began, faces of authors I'd never met but somehow knew by heart, I stopped laughing. A heavy man with green and red eyes muttering about whiskey and destiny. Another, leaner, bespectacled, eyes sad and sharp, talking about flanks and footnotes as if war itself could be diagrammed. I saw him on the periphery of bonfires, in the rear-view mirror at night, in the tobacco-stained air of deer camps. They were coming. The Huffy had invited them, and so I learned the first law of the cursed bicycle. It wasn't transportation. It was a summons. The night before they arrived, I dreamed of the Model T from 1915, the one that rumbled down the red dirt road in the prologue of this tale, blasting a song that shouldn't exist yet. Only now the headlamps weren't lamps at all. They were eyes, hollow and burning, scanning me with the cold patience of something that had waited 100 years for me to be born. I woke up sweating, the bicycle in the yard again, its chain rattling though there was no wind. That was chapter 1 of my life, not the neat beginning of a boy on a bike, but the messy opening of a novel I hadn't agreed to be in. By the time the ghosts in tweed finally knocked on my door, I already knew the truth. The author was out there, and he was using me for ink. Ghosts in tweed. Now, a man my age learns a few things, and most of 'em ain't worth the breath it takes to tell 'em. But one thing I'll stand by is this: ghosts don't always show up in sheets, rattling chains like they're late on a payment. Sometimes they just arrive. They show up in the middle of a perfectly good Tuesday afternoon wearing tweed jackets, smelling of whiskey and bad decisions, looking for a story they ain't even in yet. I was sitting on my porch, which ain't so much a porch anymore as it is a front row seat to all of time, just watching the heat settle on the gravel road. My old hound Duke was asleep at my feet, his legs twitching now and then, probably chasing a rabbit that's been dead and gone since 1942. It was quiet, the real kind of quiet, where you can hear the corn growing and your own thoughts getting dusty. That's the kind of quiet you learn to treasure, because it's usually the last thing you hear before the world decides to get loud again. And just like that, it got loud. Not in the ears, mind you, but in the soul. Duke knew before I did, of course. The dog always knows. He went from a dead sleep to dead still in half a second. His hackles went up, his tail went stiff as a poker, and he let out a low growl from deep in his chest, the kind that says, "Boss, we got company that don't belong to this particular Tuesday afternoon." They just appeared. Right there on Proctor's stretch of red dirt, blood dark in the afternoon haze. One second, there was nothing but heat shimmers and horseflies. The next, there they were. No puff of smoke, no crack of thunder. They just sort of bled into the world like a new sentence getting written onto a page that was already full. One fellow was small and bristling with a coiled manic energy like a watch spring wound too tight. He had a fire in his eyes that could burn down a barn from 50 paces. The other was taller, more patrician, looking around with the quiet vexation of a historian trying to find a footnote for a place that ain't been written yet. They were a sight, I'll tell you, dressed in those heavy wool jackets in the middle of an Arkansas summer, looking for all the world like two professors who'd taken a wrong turn at the dawn of creation and had been arguing about the directions ever since. "Well now, Duke," I muttered, scratching the old dog behind his ears to let him know I was on the case. "Looks like a couple of fellas from the library decided to take the scenic route." But it was the feel of 'em that was the thing. They carried their own weather. The air around 'em smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and bourbon, so potent it could peel paint. They weren't ghosts of dead folks. They were ghosts of stories. The kind of fellas who wrestle with words so big they leave bruises on your soul just listening to 'em. This was a different class of spook altogether. And they weren't looking at the house, though. Weren't looking at me and Duke on our infinite porch. They were looking at the bicycle, that cursed Huffy. It was leaning against Proctor's fence, same as it ever was, looking all innocent with its one busted pedal and its rusty chain that sagged like a tired old man's smile. By daylight, it was nothing but a piece of junk mail from yesterday, but I knew better. That bike, is a door. I watched the smaller fella, the one with the mean streak and the famous red and green eyes that seemed to see two worlds at once, take a slow step toward it. He didn't touch it. Didn't have to. You could feel the air get thick and heavy around that Huffy, like it was humming a low tune that only he and I and maybe old Duke could hear. It was the sound of two different times rubbing up against each other, making a spark. The bike wasn't just a bike anymore. It was a summons. It was an anchor for stories that had come loose from their moorings, and it had just snagged two of the biggest ones to ever swim in the muddy waters of the South. I leaned back in my rocker, the wood groaning a comfortable complaint. I saw the version of this Proctor fella that lived a quiet life and died in his sleep. His world was never touched by this kind of magnificent, high-octane foolishness. His bicycle was just the bicycle. But this one, this Proctor here, his stream was about to get a whole lot deeper and a whole lot muddier. The Huffy had seen to that. "This is going to get loud, Duke," I said, and the dog just sighed, a long, weary sound that said he knew his afternoon nap was officially over. When the ghosts of Southern literature show up for a party, you can bet on two things. The whiskey will flow, and somebody's going to end up in a ditch wondering how they and the Sam Hill got there. And I had a powerful feeling that old Huffy was fixing to lead the parade.
Chapter 3. The Quest for Rum. That Sunday began with me, Shelby Foote, and William Faulkner, or Bill, as he insisted on being called, already way off the rails. The initial shock of their spectral appearance on my lawn had worn off, replaced with the grim, sweaty acceptance that my life was now a collaboration with the ghosts of Southern literature. They stood on my porch, their tweed jackets in affront to the August heat, looking like specters from a dusty university library. Bill, the Nobel Prize-winning author, was less a literary titan and more a big old wild bear with red and green eyes that seemed to see two worlds at once, a mean streak and a penchant for epic dumb decisions. He paced my porch, the boards groaning under the weight of his existential impatience. Shelby Foote, the Civil War historian, proved equally unhinged, quietly inspecting the cursed Huffy as if it were a Confederate artifact. Bill's pronouncement, when it came, was not a request, but a declaration of divine need. "Forget this mess, y'all," Bill declared, his voice a rumbling growl even more slurred than I thought possible for this early in the day. "Let's go get us some more whiskey. I want some mother-loving rum, people." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose, feeling the onset of a headache that I knew would last for days, possibly decades. "Bill, it's Sunday, for crying out loud," I said. "We're in the South. You can't just go get some rum from the liquor store." Bill just waved a dismissive hand, nearly tumbling over. "Boy," he slurred, fixing me with those two colored eyes, "the laws of God and man are suggestions at best, especially in this county." He scoffed, already stumbling toward my truck. "I know a guy." And just like that, the whiskey gospel had its first mission. Chapter 4. The Historian's Humiliation. Bill's "I know a guy" was, of course, a declaration of war against sobriety and common sense. We piled into my truck. Bill took the passenger seat, humming some discordant tune, leaving the esteemed Civil War historian Shelby Foote to sit in the back, silent and lost in thought. Bill directed me down a series of progressively less maintained roads, from cracked asphalt to loose gravel, and finally to a dusty red dirt track that seemed to vanish into the piney woods. "The man's place is fortified," Bill noted with satisfaction, as if we were scouting an enemy bunker.
The bootlegger's yard was less a fortress and more a clearing of profound neglect, centered around a sagging trailer and a collection of rusted oil drums. Bill, all business, stumbled out of the truck and marched to the trailer door, leaving me and Shelby to wait in the oppressive, humid silence. I was about to light a cigarette when the odor hit me. It was sharp, pungent, and unmistakable. It was the smell of a man who had, to put it politely, lost a significant battle with his own bladder. I turned around in my seat. Shelby Foote was still staring out the window, a look of mild academic interest on his face, completely oblivious. "Shelby, man," I said, my voice strained. The smell was getting worse. "Shelby, man!" He turned to me, his eyes distant. "A fascinating defensive perimeter, Proctor. The use of natural cover, the briar patch, is a classic example of passive-aggressive fortification. Reminds me of—" "Shelby, man, you're a mess!" I finally burst out, unable to hold back the olfactory horror. "You wet your pants in the car in the bootlegger's yard." Shelby blinked, his gaze slowly returning from 1863. He looked down at his soaked tweed trousers as if they were a curious artifact he had just discovered. He didn't register embarrassment. He just mumbled something about flanking maneuvers and holding positions. I concluded right then that he was not just equally unhinged, but quite possibly the smelliest author I ever met, too. Just then, Bill returned, his arms laden with liquor, a triumphant grin on his face. He got in, sniffed the air, and just grunted, "Smells like victory." Chapter 5. Mushrooms, Banjos, and Bootleggers. The thing about Southern Sundays, especially in Arkansas, is that nothing ever really ends when it should. Our so-called Odyssey, fueled by 12 fists of liquor, veered hard into madness. Bill, energized by his quest, directed us to an old property associated with the Foote family, while Shelby, still damp and muttering about flanking maneuvers, provided a dry historical account of the land. Bill was already striding into the tall grass, his eyes scanning the ground with the intensity of a prospector. Then a triumphant cry. He hadn't found gold. He'd found a small cluster of blue fungi pushing up through the damp earth. "Man, Bill, that's not portobello," I warned, my voice laced with a deep and abiding dread. "That's the blue ones, man. I heard that stuff helps you see things." Faulkner, who was already eating mushrooms like they were going out of style, just waved a dismissive hand. He popped one into his mouth and chewed thoughtfully, a beatific, if utterly mad, smile on his face. "These things here, they keep me regular," he insisted. Within minutes, the mushrooms began their work. Bill's eyes took on their familiar red and green glow. He began seeing Indians and stuff, acting utterly nuts. His education of the locals, it turned out, involved an instrument he now produced from the back of my truck, a banjo. His stated purpose was, bafflingly, for him to teach those black folks how to play it. A small group of farm hands who worked the adjacent property had gathered at the fence line, drawn by the commotion. I tried to intervene. "Bill, the folks already know how to play the banjo, man," I exclaimed. "If they want to, they just don't like that thing." But Bill, on a mission from his own id, would not be deterred. "I'm showing them how to play it," he retorted, wobbling toward the circle of onlookers, the clinky contraption clutched in his hand. He launched into a clumsy, discordant rendition. The onlookers watched in stony silence, their patience worn thin. It didn't last long. A tall, powerful-built man with a kind but tired face stepped forward. He didn't say a word. He simply took the banjo from Bill's hands. Then, with a swift, efficient motion, he broke it over Faulkner's head. The sound was a sharp, percussive crack. Faulkner staggered back, a look of profound, childlike shock on his face. The man looked at the splintered neck of the banjo and then at Bill. He said, "I told you 8 times I don't like that thing. If I'm going to make some music, I'm going to make it with an 808, man." Faulkner, stunned into silence, just blinked, a small trickle of blood tracing a line from his scalp. The whiskey gospel had been preached, and the congregation had responded with a resounding, splintering rebuttal.
Chapter 6. The Fart Monster and the Cursed Carp. Night fell heavy and humid over the backwoods of Arkansas. The sun didn't so much set as it was smothered by the thick, oppressive canopy of pine and cypress, leaving behind a darkness that was absolute and buzzing with the sound of a million unseen insects. By 9:30 p.m., we were muddy and nasty and bloody, like we'd crawled out of some Civil War foxhole, minus the glory. The banjo incident had left Faulkner with a shallow but meaningful gash on his scalp, a physical punctuation mark on his failed attempt at cultural outreach. He seemed unbothered, however, his mind now fully adrift on the shimmering electric blue sea of the mushrooms he had consumed with such gusto. Our chaotic, aimless driving had led us, inevitably, to a deer camp somewhere near Fountain Hill. It was a rough-hewn cabin surrounded by a collection of mismatched, battered pickup trucks, a single flickering porch light cutting a weak swath through the darkness. A bonfire crackled in a clearing, casting dancing shadows on the faces of a half-sober Arkansas outdoorsman. It was here that Shelby Foote, who had been nursing his wounded dignity in silence since the bootlegger's yard, found his stage. Smelling like trouble and cheap beer, he held a rapt audience of inebriated Arkansas outdoorsmen in a big concentric circle. He was no longer the damp, embarrassed historian from a truck. He was the master orator, the weaver of grand narratives. "And the cavalry, my friends, was a torrent," Shelby boomed, gesturing wildly with a half-empty can of Natty Light, sloshing its contents onto the thirsty ground. "This fine brew, though with fewer historical consequences, one hopes." Bill, meanwhile, was even deeper into his mushroom trip, chewing the fungi like breath mints. He stared into the fire, his red and green eyes reflecting the flames, seeing visions of Indians, banshees, and who knows what else. The man was lost to time. Our time at the deer camp ended, as all such things must, when one of the hunters offered us a ride in his prized possession, an ancient, impeccably maintained Model T. We loaded into the antique car, Faulkner wedged in the back with 2 rednecks who seemed both honored and terrified to be in his presence. I sat up front, chain-smoking some particularly potent weed, trying to act as a human buffer between my literary companions and the unsuspecting locals. The car quickly filled with the noxious stench of a fart so powerful, so profoundly offensive, that it seemed to possess its own physical weight. It was a silent, creeping horror that my eyes watered. But Bill, deep in his trip, didn't just smell it, he saw it. His eyes went wide, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He began to point a trembling finger at the air in front of him, a space that, to the rest of us, contained nothing but the foul-smelling evidence of someone's digestive distress. It has eyes," Bill shrieked, his voice cracking with a fear that was shockingly real. I turned to look at him, the smoke from my joint curling around my head.
Dude, what are you talking about? It's red and green, he moaned, shrinking back against the seat, his gaze fixed on the invisible horror. It's a red and green demon of flatulence, he Proctor. I, attempting to maintain some semblance of order, tried to soothe him. Dude, we're just making a loop, man. That's not the case, man. Chill out. You know, this redneck's gonna lose his cool. But Bill was beyond reason, lost in a vision of profound gaseous evil. It's a monster, he howled, his voice rising to a pitch fever. This guy up here is releasing monsters. Despite my attempts to calm him, he was already halfway out the door, convinced that our driver was some sort of demonic entity summoning foul spirits into the cramped confines of the automobile. With a final piercing scream about the horrors he was witnessing, he jumped out of the moving car into the dark, wild woods. The driver slammed on the brakes, the ancient car shuddering to a halt. The two rednecks in the back looked at me, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. I just sighed, tossed the roach in my joint out the window, and opened my door. "I'll go get him," I said, a wave of profound weariness washing over me. I gave chase, crashing through the underbrush, following the sounds of Faulkner's terrified shrieks. I found him knee-deep in a creek, battered, bloody, and wrestling what he claimed was a cursed carp. He was covered in sand and rocks, a cursed thing himself, pulled from the depths of his own hallucinatory nightmare. He had the large, slimy fish in a headlock, convinced it was a foot soldier of the flatulent demon he had seen in the car. He was screaming at it, demanding to know the battle plans of its gaseous master. I stood on the muddy bank, the cool night air on my face, and looked at the Nobel Prize laureate, a bloody, raving mess locked in a mortal struggle with a fish. Our long, wild, lawless Sunday had finally reached its apotheosis of absurdity.
Chapter 7. The Eudora Catfish Insurgency. We were aiming for Mississippi, a return to some semblance of familiar ground, but in the disoriented chaos of the night, a wrong turn led us instead to Eudora, Arkansas. The town was asleep, save for a single beacon of light and frying oil, a catfish joint. We stumbled inside, a trio of walking disasters, dirty, smelling, loud, all of us very confused. The patrons, a mix of late-night truckers and locals, stared at us as we entered. Then a murmur of recognition went through the room. Some of them, improbably, recognized Bill and Shelby. This was a mistake. A small crowd gathered around Foote, their faces alight with reverence. They asked him about Shiloh, about Johnston's fatal hesitation, about the tactics of Forrest. Shelby, his dignity fully restored, basked in the attention. He was no longer the damp, unhinged man from the bootlegger's yard. He was the master historian, holding court, his mellifluous drawl filling the small restaurant. I watched Bill's face curdle. He stood alone, ignored, a forgotten genius in a room suddenly captivated by a mere chronicler of other men's deeds. He simmered, his red and green eyes glowing with a dangerous light. It was a fit of existential jealousy, a primal rage against the intolerable slight of being overlooked. He saw the attention shifting to Shelby, and his hand twitched. He reached for a nearby plate. "Silence!" Bill roared, his voice cutting through Shelby's lecture on Confederate supply lines. He had grabbed a fried catfish from a nearby plate, and he held it aloft like a golden scepter. "Do you not see the genius among you, the man who wrestled bears and demons and wrote?" Then he hurled the fish at a nearby table with the fury of a slighted god. For a moment, the room was stunned into shocked silence. Then a hush puppy was thrown in retaliation, and the world erupted. What followed was pure chaos, an all-out food fight of biblical proportions. Ketchup on the walls, hush puppies flying like shrapnel, even the dogs and chickens from outside somehow got involved, drawn by the scent of battle and dropped food. The county deputies, when they arrived, waded into the fray, and after a moment of stunned disbelief, they too joined in, their professional duty overwhelmed by the sheer infectious joy of the pandemonium. Eventually, they had to call in state police, the Arkansas Bureau of Investigation, and all kinds of wild stuff. The catfish joint had become a war zone. In the midst of the beautiful screaming chaos, Shelby, pretty darn smart when the situation called for it, executed a masterful distraction. He winked at Bill, a silent signal between co-conspirators. He then climbed onto a chair, or perhaps the podium at the front, as this place also served as a church on Sunday mornings, raising his hands for silence, though no one was listening. "I'll tell you right now. I'll tell you where I hid everything. It's just near where we are." It was a stroke of genius. There was, of course, nothing to hide, but the promise of a hidden treasure, a secret stash, was an irresistible lure. The effect was instantaneous. The entire population of Eudora, local cops, state investigators, every racial and zoological demographic, and yes, bicycles, plural, stopped their culinary combat and as one stampeded down the highways searching for the phantom hidden goods. In the sudden, blessed silence of the empty, food-spattered restaurant, we simply got in the car, eased out the back door, and vanished into the night like ghosts, leaving behind a scene of beautiful devastation and a town united in a fruitless collective treasure hunt.
Chapter 8. The Time Machine and the Fried Chicken Prophecy. The escape from Eudora should have been the end of it. It was the chaotic, definitive climax of a particular, wild, lawless, whiskey-soaked Sunday of Southern mischief. We had survived. We were free. But I was beginning to learn that with Bill and Shelby, the end of one bad idea is just the prologue to a worse one. This, it turned out, wasn't their first trip to my time. They'd been coming forward for years, slipping through a shimmering vortex in reality like they were just popping down to the corner store. And they didn't come for enlightenment. They didn't come to save the world or study the decline of Western civilization. They came for two specific modern miracles: gas station fried chicken and modern rap music. "Proctor, my boy," Bill Faulkner declared one afternoon, his face slick with grease as he stepped from a shimmering ripple in the air behind a cross at Conoco, a paper sack in his hand. This is God's own poultry." He had developed a profound spiritual addiction to pressure-fried 8-piece specials. Shelby, for his part, was obsessed with the music. The 808, man, that the banjo player had mentioned, had been a revelation to him. Their time machine, the same Model T that had haunted my family in 1915, was outfitted with a monstrous sound system. I'm talking some 15s in the back, rattling the antique frame. You haven't lived until you've seen William Faulkner, Nobel laureate, rolling through the back roads of Arkansas in a 1915 Model T, windows rattling, blasting Migos, Lil Baby, and Future. They were convinced they were saving literature through bass. And as I sat in the back, the floor vibrating and the air tasting of bourbon and spicy breading, I was starting to believe them.
Chapter 9. The Atlanta Detour and the Celestial Scholar. Time had stopped fitting together properly. One minute we were crossing the Mississippi River Bridge, the flat, familiar delta stretching out on either side. The next, we weren't. The world dissolved and reformed. The humid air of the river was replaced by the electric, smoky haze of an Atlanta nightclub. The sounds of crickets was gone, obliterated by a bass line so heavy it felt like a second heartbeat. "Trout music," Bill Faulkner mumbled, his eyes wide with a manic scholarly appreciation. Trap music. Migos was live on stage and the place was jamming, a sea of bodies moving as one. Shelby Foote looked appalled, as if he'd been dropped into a battle he had no maps for. I was just trying to keep my bearings, a sober man in a profoundly altered state. And then we saw her. She was on stage and the crowd had parted to watch her. Sunshine, as we'd come to know her, was a celestial scholar, a storm with a thesis. She was, to put it plainly, twerking on stage. But this was not just a dance, it was a lecture. She was, improbably, defending her PhD dissertation on drug use and geography and fucking gender. She was part demigoddess, part academic weapon, and she was explaining the complex socio-political implications of twerk physics to a room that was utterly captivated. Bill was instantly, utterly smitten. "My God, Proctor," he slurred, grabbing my arm, this woman is a whirlwind of pure, unadulterated motion." I tried to warn him. "Don't mess with these girls, man. That's sunshine-level danger. That's phone call your mama and cry on the hood of the Model A danger." It was useless. While Future took the stage to perform a remix, Bill made his move. And the craziest part? She was crazy over Bill Faulkner. I watched baffled as this beautiful, brilliant woman was somehow charmed by a drunken, century-old ghost who smelled like a bootlegger's floor. "This motherfucker's so drunk you don't even know where he's at," I muttered, "and she's just all over." She saw the genius beneath his drunken bluster, and in the space between one song and the next, they simply vanished. Gone. We were left staring at an empty space on the dance floor. This unsanctioned act of narrative fraternization was apparently a step too far for the cosmos. The music sputtered and died. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the club into a sudden, ominous darkness. Then a boomed voice from the ceiling, the same voice that had commissioned us from a cosmic bowling alley, but now it was not amused. It was the sound of a very irritated God. "Enough!" it roared. "Your sidelined adventures have become a narrative liability. It's time for a mandatory revision." The floor beneath our feet dissolved. We were being pulled out, forcibly teleported by a deity who had clearly had enough of our nonsense. The party, it seemed, was over.
Chapter 10. Betty Ford Blues. The voice of the irate God was not a suggestion, it was a deletion. The floor of the Atlanta nightclub dissolved beneath us. The throb of the trap music vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring silence, and the smell of palm trees, hot pavement, and something distinctly herbal. We had been forcibly teleported. The mandatory revision had spat us out onto the sun-warmed asphalt of a California parking lot. The year was October 1982. Bill, Shelby, Sunshine, and I stood blinking at the sign. "Welcome to the Betty Ford Center. New rules, new you." This was not, however, a standard rehab. This was a rehab with a twist. We soon learned the new rule. Hard drinkers were subjected to a mandatory weed cleanse. The requirement was simple: consume 1 ounce of the highest grade local weed every day for 30 days. The guest list was a who's who of Hollywood's beautifully broken, washed-up TV cowboys, disco casualties, and a few ex-presidential siblings, all of them starstruck and wanting selfies with the time-traveling literary giants.
Bill Faulkner was miserable. He sat in a group therapy circle, clutching a velvet pouch of Blue Dream, muttering about the existential agony of being a celebrity stoner. His existential dread was interrupted by a facilitator with a drill sergeant's haircut. "Mr. Faulkner, you need to put some pants on and finish your critical cush if you want to graduate from the program." Shelby Foote, on the other hand, was a Southern fried Houdini, the Scooby-Doo of escape rooms. He led multiple breakouts, always preceding his attempt by yelling, "Bro!" before vanishing with the house cat and 3 confused celebrities in tow. Our antics were not unnoticed. The National Enquirer ran an explosive headline, "Real-life Faulkner in rehab. Drunk on whiskey, high on sativa, talks to Elvis's ghost." This prompted Congress to hold hearings on the dangers of historical figures in modern pot clinics. Thanks to Shelby's Scooby-Doo level escape genius, our crew, Bill, Shelby, Sunshine, a very dazed Clint Eastwood, and I, slipped out during the final closing circle. We commandeered a wood panel station wagon from the valet Curie and vanished down I-10, blending into the golden haze of California myth.
Chapter 11, Blunt Force Discovery. The escape from the Betty Ford Center didn't lead to freedom. It led to another, stranger form of institutionalization. We had barely managed to part ways with a very dazed and grateful Clint Eastwood in Barstow when the summons arrived. It wasn't a booming voice from God this time. It was just a blacked-out government bus that materialized at the gas station where we were arguing over directions, its doors hissing open with a chilling, bureaucratic finality. We were bussed to Area 51. The air buzzed. Not with conspiracy, but with a kind of mundane, high-security boredom. Inside, it was less X-Files and more a cosmic community college. Sure, there were aliens, gray ones and green ones, and one with a magnificent mullet who was chewing Red Man. Supercomputers lined the walls, their screens flashing not complex equations, but TikTok memes and gospel lyrics. The place smelled of ozone, stale coffee, and government-grade cannabis. I was already there, having been classified by the government as non-threatening after they analyzed my blood and found it to be 99% Delta 9, 1% nostalgia. The rest of the crew was integrated immediately. Faulkner, ever the philosopher, found himself in a deep discussion with a 7-foot-tall praying mantis who apparently had a Ph.D. about existential horror. Sunshine, unfazed, ran an impromptu yoga rap session for a group of curious grays. Shelby, however, found love, or something like it. He was utterly smitten with Glurb, a lavender-skinned being who communicated entirely through subsonic vibrations and the collected lyrics of 1980s country music. I watched him for 20 minutes as he listened to Glurb, who sounded like a vibrating mattress, and replied, "Yes, I agree. Islands in the Stream is the pinnacle of the form."